Welcome back. So in this video for Chapter 6 in Industrial Organization, we're going to talk about some models that we can maybe use our monopoly model with, right? So we've got a model which is not necessarily completely realistic, but there are times where firms behave more like monopolies than other times. And one time, of course, could be where people have an addiction. Now, we can think of this as like a literal addiction, with like illegal drugs or, tobacco or alcohol. Um, but we can also think of it as, a really strong habit where people, develop a taste for something and then they really don't want to switch. And so the idea here is that the monopolist in this case has to think about both the period one, right, the sort of pre-addiction period, and then the period two or the post-addiction period. And what we said in the last videos was that with a more elastic demand curve, right, prices are lower and profits are lower. And we can think of that as kind of representing the pre-addiction phase. But then post-addiction, demand becomes much more inelastic. And so prices and profits are higher. And so the firm needs to take that change into account in the second period when they're setting their first period price and quantity. And so we won't sort of solve this too technically, but we'll just sort of walk through the intuition here. And so it's a two-period model, right? So total profits are here with capital Pi, and that's just profits in period one and profits in period two. And we'll just leave period two profits alone for the moment, but that means that, period one profits are total revenue in period one minus total costs in period one. And then we can differentiate with respect to Q1. Now, if there was no connection between the first period and the second period, then it would just be the same as we had before, right? You would solve the profit maximization in period one, and then you would solve it again in period two. But because there's an addiction, that means the more that you sell in period one, the higher are your profits in period two, right? You're getting people addicted or used to your product. You're making those habits. And so then in period two, you're going to be able to sell more at a higher price and get higher profits. And so what that becomes is, we take the derivative of total profits with respect to Q1, we get our usual marginal revenue minus marginal cost, but then we have this third term where it's the differentiation of profits in period two with respect to Q1 quantity. And that's going to be positive because the more we sell in Q1, the more people are going to want to buy in Q2 when they're addicted to our product. And so because of that, that means we're going to want to sell more in Q1. And the way we sell more in Q1 is with a lower price, right? And so this helps explain the sort of pricing behavior of firms in that pre-addiction phase, right? So, they had the example in the book of, drug dealers, illegal drug dealers giving out low cost or free samples to people to get them addicted and then charging them more. But we can also think of it in less illegal terms with like student discounts, right? So, you think about Apple or Google or the newspaper like the New York Times giving student discounts to get people using their products and used to their products so that when they graduate and have a job, now they don't really want to switch, and so the firms can charge them higher prices. The opposite is true when we think about durable goods, right? So with durable goods, these are goods that are going to last over multiple periods. And so when you buy in one period, that means that you don't need to buy in other periods. And so if we look at the same equation that we had before, right, where we're differentiating total profits with respect to first period quantity, we get the same equation, but now this derivative of second period profits with respect to Q1 first period quantity is going to be negative, right? Because if someone buys in the first period, that means they don't need to buy in the second period. And so that means that the monopolist will actually produce less in period one than it would if there was no connection between the two periods. And I mean, I think we can use this type of model to explain some of the things that we see where firms try to get people to buy, every year or every other year when they perhaps don't need to, right? So it could be something like planned obsolescence where products just don't last as long as they could. But it could also just be a marketing strategy where, every year, something is new and you got to have it, right? You got to have the new iPhone. You got to have, the new car. You got to have new whatever. And so they're always adding features, whether or not this adds a lot to the product. If they can convince enough people to, buy every year, then that increases their sales. So one area that we talked about in that first video was when there's a barrier, when there's sort of an economic or cost barrier to entry. And we said that in this case, what happens is we get a downward sloping average cost curve where it's always cheaper for one firm to produce than for multiple firms to produce. And so the problem here is that, we want to be here where marginal revenue equals where the price is equal to marginal cost, right? At C. That gives us our quantity. We would actually have to pay up here at the average cost, right? Because price has to at least be equal to average cost for firms to stay in business. But if we have a monopoly, then they're just going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost over here, and then set the price, on the demand curve up here. And so in this case, where we have this type of natural monopoly, where, it's often things like utilities, we need some sort of regulation. And we'll talk about that more throughout the semester. But basically what we end up often doing is just regulating quantity and price. Sometimes some places in the world and even in the United States have sort of publicly owned utilities where they are basically, trying to set price and quantity equal to the sort of most efficient level. Now, in the last video, we talked about the sort of inefficiency of monopoly, both on a static level and on a dynamic level. Now, some economists have pushed back on that, right? Some economists have said, well, if monopoly profits come from innovation, come from being more efficient or developing better products, then it's okay for those firms to have those monopoly profits, right? So this is what Schumpeter was saying. He was saying, the whole process of creative destruction is driven by these technological innovations, and then firms get to enjoy those profits because they were more innovative, right? And I mean, I think there's definitely some truth to that. I think the problem comes when, a firm becomes a monopoly just through merger and acquisition, right? Which was sort of what was going on in the late 19th century with Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. But also, even when a firm becomes big because of, being a superior firm, because of technological innovation, sometimes they can then use those profits not to continue to innovate and not to continue to be a superior firm, but to, lobby the government for other protections. And then that means that we're not getting that competition. And now we're in that both static and dynamically inefficient piece. But I think the main point of Schumpeter is that we might be willing to accept some static inefficiency if we're getting dynamic efficiency in the long run. Okay, so we're going to stop there with this video, and then our last video for Chapter 6 will be on monopolistic competition.